You're listening to Business Success in a Virtual World podcast. If you are a leader navigating these new immersive technologies, this is your definitive resource to understand the innovative power of XR, VR, and AR. I'm Tim Barton, Chairman of Creative Strategies, and I'm joined by Barton Goldenberg, President of ISM Guide. In each episode, we navigate through new products, effective strategies, and highlight actual business case studies implementing extended reality into business processes. Our resource website now boasts over 300 case studies, 300 articles, and 100 videos presenting successful examples of businesses using these technology in field service, training, digital twins, customer service, in medical and manufacturing, and so much more. Check out the website at ismguide.com. Now, on to the next episode. We're breaking format a little bit. In the past, we've basically spent the time doing case studies, but we've got a distinguished guest today with us, Liz Hyman, who's CEO and president of the XR Association. And I'll let her start out by explaining what she does in that role and the role of the association. And then we've got some key questions. Barton, let's start with you, at least introducing Liz. You had her on your panel at CES.
You know, Liz has a very interesting background. I remember correctly, she's a lawyer by profession. And she's been with a couple of companies and a couple of associations. So she's both clever and experienced. And I just was wondering, Liz, let me give you an opportunity to tell everybody, our listeners, a little bit about the XR Association. How did you get formed? What are the goals of the association? So everybody kind of knows that it exists and why it exists.
Great. Well, Tim Barton, thank you so much for having me. This is terrific to be able to join you. I am always thrilled to be able to talk about the XR Association. So I'm coming up on, or actually just past my 5th anniversary as the founding CEO. And a number of companies came together many years ago and said, look, this is a technology that we believe is going to be sort of a massive part of our next computing platform. And we need to come together as an industry and think about ways in which we can kind of lift up the industry for everybody and to work on issues that maybe happen in the halls of Congress or in other governmental organizations and entities, whether it's here in the United States or even around the world. And how do we come together and have a convening platform to get some common voice and to work towards what I would say is a really important balance between consumer safety and protection and an environment that allows for innovation. This podcast is about business, and you often want to make sure that you have a regulatory framework that allows for business and innovation to flourish. So what do? We're a nonprofit industry trade association, and we represent companies that are in VR and AR and mixed reality, digital twins, the metaverse, spatial, whatever you want to call it. We are engaged in that discussion. We bring people together, different stakeholders. Oftentimes we're asking civil society, government, academia to come sit at the table with our industry members and to talk through a lot of issues so that we can develop common approaches, common frameworks, common standards towards a variety of different topics. And we spend a lot of time educating policymakers. We all have seen in the past different hearings where maybe members of Congress or somebody in the executive branch wasn't that familiar with some sort of digital technology. And we want to make sure that that doesn't happen, because when people are not familiar with the technology and something comes up, people act out of fear if they don't understand what it is that they're looking at. So we spend a great deal of time in education, trying to build that positive regulatory environment. But we also, and this is really important, we spend a lot of time with our own membership and our own industry thinking through, how do we set a high bar for ourselves? What are best practices? What's the research that helps us to really think through those best practices? So we have sort of a dual focus, and our mission is the responsible development and advancement of immersive technologies.
Super. Tell me a little bit just for a moment about the membership. Are they small companies, medium-sized companies, big companies? Are they domestic companies? Are they global companies? How many companies? Just give us a feeling for who's a member
All
of
of
the
the above.
association.
All of the above. So we started with 5 companies. We're now around 50 member companies, and we range from your small mom and pop developer to large multinational corporations and everything in between. And we also have hardware manufacturers, but we have a lot of what we call enterprise solution providers. We're components and peripherals. We want to get infrastructure companies in. We want the whole ecosystem because this is a 360 conversation. We need everybody at the table.
Okay, good. So you've raised the issue already about, you referred to it as a regulatory framework. And obviously the government isn't interested in that, but the government isn't always ahead of the curve when it comes to technology. Sometimes one could even argue they're behind the curve. So I just wanted to share with us, if you could, how is the U.S. government preparing to challenge and regulatory framework the XR industry? Will it place restrictions on the XR companies? Will it work in hand with them? What's your read at this time on the regulatory intentions of the U.S. government?
Great question. I think the first place to start is we're a digital technology in the same way that mobile phones are, that the AI conversation that's taking place. We're going to be subject to many of the rules of the road that are already out there or in development, right? So I mean, what do I mean by that? Children's online safety, privacy bills, discussion around antitrust and competition. We're not necessarily, and I'm going to put a little footnote in this, we're not always or necessarily specifically called out in those regulatory efforts. But the reality is that the laws and frameworks are going to apply to us as a digital technology. So, for example, if you think about what's going on in Europe, the GDPR, the DMA, the DSA, all of those apply already to our technology. And we just have to sort of think through, how does it apply? Are there gaps? And sometimes the conversation with policymakers isn't so much like, hey, how do we focus on you specifically? It's, how does this apply already? So that's one thing. There are a couple of instances where we are starting to see immersive technologies called out specifically in legislation. So, for example, the Kids Online Safety Act, it's been bantied about and discussed, and there actually is a specific reference to a virtual reality environment under the bill's definition of an online platform. So that's one example. There was a lot of fuss a few months ago around the TikTok bill. If you recall, it was about divestment. But I think what's interesting is that the House version included augmented or immersive technology applications in its definition of what a covered company was. So conceivably, a company like Pico could be covered in such a bill. But I bring that up not because that's impacting us today, right? These bills haven't been enacted into law, so on and so forth. But there's a growing awareness around the technology that, I think is a double-edged sword, right? Because on the one hand, we want this technology to learn about it, and we have an opportunity to take this exposure and try to bring it into a teaching moment, if you will. So that's sort of what's happening. But again, I think what's really important to understand is there are, bills like the American Privacy Rights Act, APRA, which have very, very interesting definitions around quote unquote sensitive data that absolutely are going to impact immersive technologies. So that's sort of what we're keeping an eye on from that point of view.
You've mentioned something interesting, and I think our audience is definitely would be interested in your take. But the immersive market has no boundaries; it's a global marketplace. You've mentioned already GDPR and some other regulations that are in, for example, in this case, Europe and elsewhere. There's different mentalities in terms of how good, how bad, how risky, how not risky is this immersive world? Where does the U.S. government sit vis-a-vis other countries and other regions, in your opinion?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. Europe has a different approach. They consider privacy as sort of a human right, essentially. Whereas in the United States, I think privacy is very, very important, but we're coming at it from a different perspective, right? It's almost part of the business conversation as well. Like we want people to have trust in the technology, trust in the platforms. And so it's something that is being hashed out slightly differently from how they approach it in Europe, and it has a more of a market underpinning, I guess, for better or worse. But I think, for an industry like immersive technology, you need to step back and you need to say, hey, this is a new tech. This is something that we want more and more people to enjoy. We're seeing incredible opportunities and applications in workforce, in healthcare, in education, in manufacturing, all these different sectors. We think there's such a powerful and compelling story to share with policymakers so that they understand how this impacts different sectors of our economy. And so if we can't ensure that people have trust and faith in the technology, and this is where I get back to what are those best practices? How do we set the bar high for ourselves? Then that gives impetus to others to step in. So right now, while we're still in this period of time where we're not in the red hot glare of attention, is the time for us as an industry to really work on perfecting and address some of the things we know could be of concern.
Hey, Liz, I had the privilege over the years of being called to Washington to be involved with discussions with various legislatures on various things, more specifically to help them understand what was going on, not only in Silicon Valley, but a particular technology. For example, during the time when we were trying to transfer from analog to digital television, I spent a lot of time there educating government officials on the whole concept of going from analog to digital. And then with a company specifically who did that transition technology, helping them explain to legislatures. But I got to tell you, that was a slow process. It took us from the time we actually started that project of trying to educate them to the time we actually got it agreed to and then implemented was almost 10 years. And I'm curious, based on that earlier part of the discussion that Barton had, how up to date are they, and especially on this area? And you actually mentioned that you guys are doing a lot of education, but in that context, is there like one particular, two particular legislatures in either Senate or Congress who seem to be more aware of this and are leading the charge? That happened in our particular scenario. We ended up with two or three. And I, at this particular stage, I actually happen to know the chairman of the FCC, and I brought him out here literally to see the technology and work in how it worked. And then he became an influencer, right? But I'm curious, do you see somebody like the chair of the FCC, who says, this is something important?
Yeah. So where to begin? There's so much that I can say to answer to that. So first of all, we just finished our second annual demo on the Hill. We ended up with about 12 or 13 companies coming and setting up in the Rayburn foyer of one of the House office buildings. And we had over, I would say over maybe 150 individuals, whether they're staff, members of Congress, others, coming down and trying on the technology. Because you said something really important, Tim, which is you don't know until you try it on. You don't really get that fulsome feeling for this. But we have been working now for a few years with something called the Reality Caucus. There is a caucus on Capitol Hill that is specifically geared towards understanding and working with virtual, augmented, and mixed reality technologies.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, Susan Del Bene out of Washington State is one of the founding co-chairs. She's been just a really great leader of this discussion. Darrell Issa is the Republican co-chair. There's a number of other members of Congress, and we're always encouraging our audience to reach out to their members of Congress and tell them to join. I think what's also interesting is there's a woman named Lisa Blunt Rochester. She's a member of Congress from Delaware. She's currently running for the United States Senate, but she is the co-chair of the Workforce Caucus. So on Capitol Hill, there's all these caucuses, right, which are sort of like study groups for members of Congress where they can really dig into a particular issue or topic. And she leads the Workforce Caucus. And as a consequence of her getting to try on immersive technology and understand its power, she then went ahead, we helped to craft a bill called the Immersive Technology for the American Workforce Act. And it's to redirect grant dollars to underserved communities, whether it's rural or inner city, to get training in immersive, workforce training through immersive technology.
Wow.
So, you do have some really interesting champions. In the Senate, Senator Todd Young, we reached out to his office, and about a year or two ago, he put in a request to the Government Accounting Office to get a full description of how the federal government is using XR now for different purposes. So we're expecting a report soon from the GAO, we hope even this month, that will be a really comprehensive review of what the civilian agencies, and it is civilian, because we know DoD uses XR quite significantly, but what's going on at FEMA? What's going on at the Department of Commerce? What's going on at the Department of Transportation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're hoping to have a really good understanding of that. But someone like Senator Young, who's been a real leader, he was one of the initial sponsors of the CHIPS and Science Act and its predecessors. These guys get it. They understand the technology. It's really exciting to be out there and working with them. We were thrilled to be able to get put into the CHIPS and Science bill because of leadership from people like Senator Young and Senator Schumer and others. We got immersive technology included in that piece of legislation. When it first started, it didn't include us. And we said, wait a second, this has to include, if you're going to talk about emerging technology, it has to be at the table. So now we're in there. So there is a growing cadre of leaders, particularly on Capitol Hill, that understand the importance of the technology, are dedicated to helping us expand understanding and knowledge around the technology.
So that's really interesting, Liz. You talked a couple of times about best practices, some of the research that will help educate the congressional leaders and staff. I think you guys have actually done something quite recently. I think it was in the healthcare sector. And I thought it was a pretty exciting report. And I presume that that's something that both is important to the healthcare sector, that is the hospitals and players, to the companies and vendors that are selling into that technology, but maybe even to Capitol Hill. So could you tell us a little bit about your best practice research study that you did in healthcare?
Yeah, so there's two lines of information that I'd like to share with you. One is we often do surveys of different sectors. So we did one on healthcare. We've done one on learning and development, HR type professionals. We've done one on teachers. We surveyed 1,400 teachers across the United States. And recently, we just put one out with 600 decision makers in the manufacturing sector. And in each of these instances, we're trying to gauge what these different leaders within their sectors know about XR, whether they think it can be helpful to carrying out their work, and whether they have plans to adopt it in the future. So we think those types of surveys are really important to our membership and to the industry, and the information is on our website, and we encapsulate it into infographics to make it kind of easy and understandable for everybody.
You also share those results with the congressional leaders?
Yes, absolutely. And then we also have developed these best practice guides. So they're developer guides. We're targeting the developers, but they're sort of a proxy as well, right? So what does it take? Chapter 1 was, what does it take to build a ergonomic and safe XR environment? We did one on sort of norms and behaviors in immersive spaces. We did one, I mean, I'm proud of them all, but the one I think that has been most strongly received was around XR and accessibility. So what do you have to do to make sure that people with different disabilities and abilities have the opportunity to use the technology now, today? And we can do a lot through how we develop those experiences. And then we did one on education. If you're trying to build something for a classroom, it could be as common a thought as you've got 30 kids in 35 minutes and what do you do? So, I mean, those types of considerations. And so we've done a number of these different best practice guides, including healthcare. And we're always sharing all of those pieces of information with folks on Capitol Hill so that they're aware of where the industry is going, what this means to specific practitioners.
So you said something interesting. It's just triggered a thought. It's kind of the Apple strategy and others to get to the children young with a new technology and have them grow and learn, et cetera. So we have a very large Department of Education here in Washington, D.C. And we know seriously that XR technology is a wonderful way to teach children new ideas, places to go that they couldn't go normally, new ways of learning, new ways of looking, new ways of seeing, new ways of, collaborating. How is the Department of Education? Are they like trying to lead? Are they lagging? Where do they stand? Because that could be a fairly important agency to help propel XR forward.
Yeah. It's a great question. I'm not sure that we've had a lot of interaction thus far with the Department of Education, but I will say this. First of all, we did a year-long process here at XRA. We brought together academicians, civil society, some ex-government officials, industry, a multi-stakeholder process. And we looked at a bunch of different topics. And we then released a big paper called Charting the Future of Immersive Technology, again, on our website. But in there, we have outlined 9 initiatives that the XR Association is pursuing over the next 1 to 3 years in order to help advance the technology. And a big piece of that was around youth and XR, because we know that this is an important technology in healthcare and how young people are being exposed to XR for pain mitigation and for pain distraction and other important uses. And certainly in the classroom, we're seeing an uptick, and then for fun. And so we have a few initiatives that we want to undertake. We're actually going to work towards creating kind of a convening session to think through this topic of youth safety. What does it take to make it a safe experience? How do we emphasize sort of digital citizenship for young people? Because I know this sounds really trite, but I always say, I remember my mom taking me by the hand to teach me how to cross the street, that was a dangerous environment and I needed to learn how to look left and right and understand when I could go. We need to be doing the same thing for these types of technologies.
Great analogy.
It's inevitable that kids are going to use this type of tech. We need to make it safe. We need to make it so that parents have an opportunity to work with their children to make it a safe environment where they can pick and choose different capabilities if that's what they want to do. But all of that needs to be really explored. And then next year, we're going to come out with yet another developer's guide based on all the work we're doing this year that will help as we think about building these really safe, positive experiences for young people.
Tim, I want to turn to you. Both Liz and I sit in Washington, D.C., and you sit in Silicon Valley, and the technology to a large extent comes out of the Valley. When you hear Liz talking about the agencies and what they're trying to do, and maybe some regulatory, or for that matter, just promoting the technology, How does Silicon Valley react to this? Is it the vendor that should be proactive? Is it the vendor? How do what do you hear from the Valley about, those people in Washington D.C. or those helpers in Washington D.C.? What's the vibe out there?
Well, historically, and I go back 40 years here covering Silicon Valley wanted nothing to do with the U.S. government. They wanted to do everything behind the scenes and didn't want them to show up and didn't invite them to come over here for any reason. Technology, of course, has advanced dramatically over this time. And every one of the big companies now are interacting with government agencies on a proactive basis. At the moment, the bigger issue has been AI, where Zuckerberg and everyone has actually said they need government regulation and help, with this. I know that Apple has a group in Washington who has spoken with a lot of the congressional people about what they believe is a very important thing. And so the Valley itself now is much more interested in educating the congressional leaders of the US and other parts, as well as getting involved with them to do show and tells and everything else. So it's less of a scenario. I mean, I'll give you one anecdote. In the early days of the semiconductor, the government was scared to go to Intel. And our company was owned by a company called Business International, who did a lot of government business. So I get a call from a major from the Department of Defense, and he said, "Can you help me make an introduction to Intel?" And I go, "Of course," not understanding what I want. But basically, they wanted to go into Intel and tell them that they couldn't sell their 385 chips to China. In those days, government had a hands off. Today, they're much more proactive. I think, as Liz can tell you, Silicon Valley and the government are much more engaged than they ever have been.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would agree with that. But I think also with an emerging technology like XR, again, it's sort of incumbent on us to be proactive and to get out there and to explain the technology. You asked a question a while ago, Barton, about sort of how we look at international global markets. We did a white paper out at the end of last year called Reality Check, and we did an analysis. We partnered with George Washington University and their Digital Data Trade Hub, and we did an analysis of how different governments are approaching XR. I mean, China obviously has been very deliberate about supporting its indigenous XR industry, but the EU also has been very deliberative. South Korea, UK, these are all countries and regions that we looked at, and all of them have sort of married up, government engagement, support for areas of XR that they're engaged in, the regulatory environment that goes with it. It's all lining up. And here in the United States, we're a bit ad hoc. And this is an instance where I think it probably behooves us to ask the government to be a little more strategic about XR. And so we're out working right now to try and get a national XR strategy introduced in Congress to try to, bring together the different players to build on what Tim's talking about, which is a more engaged and we hope constructive conversation that helps. Interesting, my light just went out. That helps us to accomplish what we're, to build this industry.
We got a minute left in our podcast, so this is a fascinating discussion. I want to, and we could go on for much longer. But I would encourage everybody that's listening to the podcast, go to the XRA Association and look at all the available papers. This is a non-for-profit, so you're not paying for things per se, and they're really of a high academic and pragmatic quality. I've looked at many myself, so I would strongly encourage that. But Liz and Tim, just give me your last thoughts on, let's just go forward to 2030, 5 years from now, whatever it may be. How is the government and the Valley working together, the same, differently? Will we have a strategy? Will it be regulatory oversight? Give me your picture for 5 years from now, and in a minute or less.
Look, I think I go back to where I started the conversation, which is a lot of the work that they're doing now, whether it's on AI or privacy or competition or whatever it might be, is going to apply to XR. So the question is, do we get through this period of time when Congress is not necessarily moving? And in 5 years from now, we want a national strategy. We want to see, for example, we're working on trying to get the government to be much more deliberate about use of digital twins within federal government. That's important. And that we have a better understanding, not just of how government's using it, but why they should be using it and why that's important in their experience to share and to promote the industry as sort of a national treasure. This is going to be an important part of our economy, and we need to be out there and being positive and building up a good record.
Maybe even not ad hoc, but a little more structured. Tim, your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree with Liz completely. I think that the government, especially over the next 2 years, is going to get more interested in this, especially as more VR headsets get established and more people get used to it and understand it. I do think that the privacy issue and, to some degree, ethical issues may come up. And the issue of certain things that can be seen by kids or not is going to be also in a regulatory scenario. I don't know where we'll end up in 5 years, but Silicon Valley really at the moment is very open to having these discussions and putting in the kind of corrections if they're necessary. And I'll tell you, the key executive in Silicon Valley that's going to lead this is Tim Cook. He is extremely key on the issue of privacy, protecting kids especially, and he's done a pretty good job with it. And I know he's met with the top government officials. He met with the head of the European Union recently. He's gone to Washington many times to talk to leaders. And as Apple, especially over the next 5 years, begins evolving the Vision Pro and to moving towards AR glasses, I think Apple will actually take an even more proactive move to make sure the government is online with allowing this kind of new innovation and not hindering it.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I'll just last thing, I promise. One, would love to have Apple as part of our efforts. That would be great. And I agree. I think they're going to be a very important piece to this conversation. And we need to make sure that at the end of the day, everything that we're doing, I think industry feels very strongly about this, that people have trust and faith in the technology. That's what's going to lead to
Absolutely.
growth.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to let Tim give the closing comment, but I just want to make an observation, and it's a little provocative, but we'll have to just continue the dialogue. The government sits, there's the civilian side and there's the military side. You've already alluded to this. And everybody knows that the military is just gung-ho on using XR. It's a critical component of how they're moving their military forward. And, they're pervasive users of these technologies. And yet it's kind of weird. There's the military that's a pervasive user, and the U.S. government's kind of trying to figure out, what do we do with all this? Will be the topic of another podcast. Tim, your closing comment.
Well, I'll just say, Liz, thank you so much for joining us. It's good to see you again. We were all together at AWE a few weeks ago, and we'll watch very closely your work. We're excited about what you're doing, and wish you well. And Barton and I appreciate the fact that we've gotten to know you, and we'll be staying in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Very grateful to you both. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Business Success in a Virtual World. Barton and I have helped global companies successfully develop and implement strategies to utilize these new technologies. For more information or to contact us, please visit ismguide.com and select Metaverse Resource Center. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast on your preferred platform.